Hello and welcome back to GrassRoots Crypto, where I like to teach people about crypto. In this video, I'm going to be uploading the recording for the recent Clubhouse chat that's all about THORChain. This is a fantastic conversation with Michael, Craig, Chad, and Danielle. I really enjoyed it, got a lot of good points out of it, more information than what's in my videos. So I need to thank the Thor lady for uploading this and making this available to me so I can go ahead and put this video together. Because it's quite a long one. So thanks very much for that, the Thor lady, and hope you really enjoy this chat and get a lot out of it. And now here it is.
All of the invited speakers are here, including the admin of Into the Cryptoverse. So I want to invite each of the speakers to introduce themselves, but before I do, I wanted to quickly say a couple things, and then we'll get to the speakers so that you can learn who they are. First off, a couple of caveats about everything that we're going to be chatting about today. And the first one is that there are 3 Shapeshift employees on stage here, but this is not a Shapeshift room. We're just a bunch of crypto enthusiasts who are going to be talking about a cryptocurrency project. Next, in addition to me personally not speaking on behalf of Shapeshift, I want to make it clear that I'm not talking on behalf of THORChain either. THORChain is a decentralized project, very similar to Bitcoin. Some of you who may know me from the Telegram channel may say, well, hold on, you're an admin in one of those channels. And yes, that may be true, but I never asked for that title. And I only found out about this tech in August 2020. THORChain started much earlier than that. Like many in the Bitcoin space, the Ethereum space, the Cosmos space, and in every ecosystem that you look at, if you contribute enough, you end up being sort of a de facto staple in that community. And that's sort of what happened with me, mostly because of my passion for this project. THORChain's developers and contributors are just like me, people who want to build something that they think the world needs. Last thing I'll say before I go to the speakers is, I guess the genesis for where this idea for this Clubhouse room started. After learning of THORChain and finally wrapping my head around it and understanding how it all worked, I recognized a feeling in myself. And I hadn't felt that way since I first finished learning about Bitcoin. And I had the thought, like, holy crap, this changes everything. It's a few months later, and today I still believe that. And I do believe that THORChain will have a bigger impact on Bitcoin than any other project building on Bitcoin today. But a couple other things have changed over the last couple months. Namely, I now hold some amount of Rune. Rune is the token that backs THORChain. So how much of my belief that THORChain is a really cool, awesome system, how much of that is me just being selfish and trying to pump my own bags? Or how much of it is legitimate because of what the technology is? Also, ignoring that, what if I'm missing something? I need people people whose opinions that I trust to help me understand it. And that's where each of the speakers on stage come in. In 2014, I had a super in-depth conversation with Craig, who's up here on stage, and his point of view challenged a lot of the beliefs that I held. This man has helped build Omni. He was one of the founders of Tether. He essentially invented the stablecoin of NFTs. And over the last decade, he's helped dozens of crypto projects with his depth of knowledge. His opinion about this stuff would be super helpful to me. In 2017, when I joined Shapeshift, I met Danielle, who was probably the 5th employee at Shapeshift. I don't know exactly what, but she was like as OG as they come. And from starting out as a customer support agent at Shapeshift and then changing roles multiple times, growing with each step, she's now the director of all operations at Shapeshift. Her breadth of crypto knowledge is unmatched. And very shortly after I learned of THORChain in 2020, I met Chad, who is the technical lead of THORChain, whatever definition that means if there is no company, THORChain company or THORChain organization. I've spoken with Chad a bunch, sometimes here on Clubhouse, and I've heard him speak as well, and his knowledge of THORChain is unrivaled. So I asked Craig and Danielle and Chad to use their knowledge, their expertise, and their experience with everything related to crypto to help me explore this topic from their points of view. And their points of view are important because every good idea needs to be vetted from many, many different angles. From my point of view, from Danielle's, from a dozen of them. And what I hope to achieve here in this Clubhouse chat is a super entertaining and super engaging conversation about THORChain that will help all of us learn something from this evening. There is no debate. There are no winners of any debates. There's just engaging conversation for all of us to learn from each other. I've talked enough. Let's do some introductions. We'll go in the order that I see it here in the channel. Craig, then Danielle, then Chad.
All right, cool. Thank you, Michael. That was a fantastic introduction and a good intro into, I guess, what the conversation is tonight. I was having a conversation with Eric Voorhees of Shapeshift a month or two ago, and he said, you know, if you're looking for the next rabbit hole, you should be looking into THORChain. And I only began dipping my toes in very recently with the conversations I've been having with Michael. And I do not own any Rune, even though I tried to see how to get some over the weekend. But was unsuccessful in that, but we'll probably keep trying if the project looks like it's something worthwhile in investing and being a part of. As Michael mentioned, I've been in the crypto space since late 2013, professionally, early 2014 with the Mastercoin project, which became the Omni layer, which gave birth to Tether and the concept of the stablecoin. And then through NFTs, with the creation of digital objects, atomic systems as uniquely identifiable tokens. And I have a passion for building decentralized systems and contributing whatever knowledge is available and lessons learned over the past several years to new projects. And the questions I'm going to have for Michael are around sort of what does THORChain accomplish that has been attempted in the past where it's been unsuccessful. In the stablecoin world, with Tether, for example, you actually are living on top of a trustless system, but it still contains one element of trust. And one of the holy grails of the stablecoin concept is an algorithmic version that requires no trust, which has yet to really be invented. In the same sense, what THORChain, in my limited understanding, provides is a type of cross-chain asset exchange that also can exist fully trustless. And so my questions are going to be around how that's possible and point out some of the pitfalls that I've been aware of for different attempts to accomplish this sort of thing in the future or in the past. And so hopefully we can have that discussion and see where it goes from there. Thank you, Michael.
My name's Danielle, as Michael said. I became interested in Bitcoin in 2014. My passion for crypto really comes from my desire to live in a more free world, one that's less influenced by governments. So that's definitely where my crypto heart is. Like Michael said, I work at Shapeshift. I'm the director of operations. I started there about 5 years ago. I'm really interested in this topic and hearing from you, Michael, some things I might not know yet, and really about like what problems does this solve that other chains do not. And I also just want to say you guys can find me on my Instagram on my bio here. I've been doing some cool digital crypto art. Check it out. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, so I'm Chad. I'm the technical lead for the THORChain project. I discovered kind of Bitcoin and the blockchain age when I was traveling the world in 2017. And I really want to understand what this whole blockchain thing was. And so I decided to roll my own blockchain from scratch just to understand the technology, conceptually how it works underneath the hood, so to speak. And ever since then, I was just like completely enthralled by the revolutionary concepts behind what this technology means. And so I've been dedicating myself ever since then to focus on understand more deeply the space, different forms of technology and so forth and so on. I myself joined the THORChain project in, I think it was July of 2019. And more or less ever since then, I've been pretty dedicated on it and working hard on it. And it's been a long road, but we're very close to making good on the initial promises of the white paper in the next few weeks. And so it's really been a lot of work and hard work and sweat and all these things. But we're finally getting to the point where we're ready to release it out to the world in a way that could really reshape crypto in a way that can't be undone. And that makes me extremely excited.
John?
Oh, hey, everybody. I kind of just got invited here last minute. It's nice of Michael to include me. My name is John. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer at Shapeshift. And yeah, I'm kind of just going to ride along today. I'll kind of weigh in if needed, but these four here are kind of the stars of the event tonight. So I'll just hang out. And if you're interested in this kind of talk, please do follow the Into the Cryptoverse Club. Michael and I are going to be, and the members of that club will be trying to host interesting discussions on the crypto space on a regular basis. So thanks all. I'll hand back to you, Michael.
All right. Well, we are 10 minutes in. We have 1 hour and 50 minutes scheduled for this. Let's dive in. I'll start off with a very brief description of what THORChain is, and then we'll let the questions flow from our panelists. Whenever the panelists feel like it's appropriate to start bringing questions in from the audience, we'll start asking for questions from the audience. But to start us off, THORChain is a system that allows people to swap one digital asset for another digital asset without trusting a central company like a crypto exchange, and without trusting a central server. Also, without needing to wrap tokens or convert tokens from the real Bitcoin to a wrapped version of Bitcoin on the Ethereum network. So trustless, wrapless, cross-chain swaps without the need for any middleman or any company. And I think it's really cool. Let's start there.
Okay, well, it sounds, again, the description sounds astonishing. When we were at I guess it was the Bitcoin conference in Austin, Texas, I think it was early 2014, there were a different number of projects that were trying to accomplish cross-chain swaps by having similar private keys on different chains and trying to leverage the fact that you could use the same private key on different chains, et cetera. One of the difficulties I've always seen with asset exchanges that are occurring trustlessly is you can't modify the source code of the blockchains themselves necessarily without causing either a soft fork or a hard fork. And one of the challenges of having assets that move from one chain to the other is we always just realized that we needed a third-party chain or another chain that exists on the side that can keep track of where the assets are moving. The challenge was having the original chains recognize that those asset swaps have occurred and not require the users of each one of those chains to have to look at every single other chain in order to come to consensus upon where the assets have come from and where they landed. So my first question is if I wanted to trade a Bitcoin with someone on a different blockchain, let's say, for example, Litecoin, how do I make sure that the recipient of that intended swap is recognized on their respective chain?
Chad, you want to take this one?
Just to make sure I understand the question correctly, you're asking the question of how do I make sure that the person who's receiving the Litecoin on the other side, which it may be you and it may be your friend or something, actually does receive the Litecoin in the end? Do I understand correctly?
It essentially goes back to the settlement of the original Bitcoin itself. So let's say it's you and me want to trade. I've got Bitcoins and you've got Litecoins, and I want to swap it for my Bitcoin for your Litecoin. At some point, you're going to trade the Bitcoin I gave you for something else, and you may eventually want the actual the Bitcoin to land in its proper place at the end. At some point, my transaction that I sent to you for the swap is recorded on the Bitcoin blockchain as me losing a Bitcoin and gaining a Litecoin on the other side. That Bitcoin that I've given you needs to end up in somebody else's hands at some point. How does that get back to the Bitcoin blockchain such that the Bitcoin blockchain knows that, yes, the Litecoin exchange did occur, other exchanges happened to have occurred after that point, and eventually that Bitcoin makes it into the proper person's hands back on the Bitcoin network?
Yeah, sure. So for one, this system is not doing what you're talking about or you're describing is what sounds similar to atomic swaps. That is conceptually very different from how THORChain actually works in its kind of underbelly. THORChain uses continuous liquidity pools where individuals choose to provide liquidity into this network, into an individual pool, say the Bitcoin pool, for example. They provide Bitcoin, they provide Rune, and that becomes the counterparty to any swap that's happening on the network. Right. So I might say, I love Bitcoin, so I'm going to go ahead and provide liquidity. And somebody might say they want to swap from Bitcoin to Rune, and they will use the continuous liquidity pool as a counterparty to the trade. Now, if you want to go from Bitcoin to Litecoin, for example, for your example, that would be what we would consider to be a double swap. So effectively what's happening on the back end is you're sending in your Bitcoin to an address that is managed by the THORChain network itself through threshold signatures. It is swapped to Rune, and that Rune is sent to a Litecoin pool to be swapped into Litecoin, and then it finally gets sent out to some address that you specified that you wanted to send it to, per location, LTC address or whatever it might be. So it's not an actual peer-to-peer in the sense of like there's a buyer and a trader and they're being paired and they're being swapped between the two people. It's more of an individual, not individual, but a network between it all that's being the counterparty to all trades, somewhat a little bit similar to what Shapeshift does to some degree, being the counterparty to, or used to do more accurately, being the kind of the middleman, if you want to call them that is the counterparty to all trades. So when you send your Bitcoin to the network, you're sending your Bitcoin into an address that is a threshold signature address that is managed by the validators of this network. And the validators are economically incentivized to make sure that the information is correct and that they have no actual ability economically, technologically, or cryptographically from a cryptographic perspective to actually be able to thieve, steal, manipulate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that none of that can actually reasonably happen in the network. So when you send your Bitcoin in for Litecoin, you're sending your Bitcoin into a THORChain controlled wallet address, and then the network observes that transaction and says, okay, you want to send this, a transaction from this Bitcoin to this specific Litecoin address that you specified in that Bitcoin transaction, and then it swaps it to Litecoin internally through its internal logic, and then it says, okay, we get the Litecoin amount that you got to send out. Here we go, sending it off to this address that you specified.
So
quick
Chad,
recap. Hold on, Daniel, before you jump in, just quick recap of 3 important points there. Number 1, it is not atomic swaps. You are swapping with THORChain, not with the other party. Number 2, you send one batch of coins into the decentralized THORChain network, and you receive the new batch of coins from the decentralized THORChain network. And 3, it uses these continuous liquidity pools, which are very similar to what we see on UniSwap with their liquidity pools.
Okay.
Danielle, you were going to say something.
I was just going to ask Chad, is it the validators then that ensure that it actually all goes through and that everybody, is settled up at the end?
Yeah, validators control the THORChain network itself. It is the state chain, the stateful chain that actually understands all the commands coming in, all the funds coming in, all the funds going out, and observes all the wallets that are controlling all the different funds within the network. It's their job to make sure that all happens smoothly and consistently, and they're all economically incentivized to ensure that always is true.
I think a lot of us, we are really driven or gravitate more towards these decentralized protocols, but a lot of people really value having someone to talk to, or they really value, having someone kind of be that responsible party of their funds. What would you tell people who want to trust this, and how can they trust it?
Well, so to the first part of your question, some people value the having somebody to talk to and all these things. That's perfectly valid. Some people want to have that, and I have no qualms with that whatsoever. If you want to do that, then give Binance a call or Coinbase or one of these exchanges. Or Kraken. They're all good companies and they all provide really good service. I use them myself from time to time. Go nuts. But THORChain is not that. THORChain is a centralized chain that operates not on reputation of individuals. It operates based upon the governance of code. Code always does what it's told to do 100% of the time. It can never not do what it's supposed to do. It always behaves identically the same every single time. And so I will always trust code over people, because people can get corrupted, people can be ignorant or stupid or any of these things. It happens all the time, not just in crypto, but in the greater world. And that's the reason why having these systems governed by code rather than individuals is much more reliable and much more operates exactly the way you know it will with 100% certainty.
Okay, so when I'm doing a transaction on Bitcoin, obviously it's a one-way transaction. There's no possibility of chargebacks. And I'm sending a transaction. I'm relieving myself of Bitcoins and giving them to a THORChain address that is then going to be, propagated to the THORChain network into its liquidity pool to get the Litecoin that I eventually wanted. Now, I have no means of recalling that Bitcoin back to myself if, for example, the transaction doesn't eventually occur on the Litecoin side. So in terms of liquidity availability on the Litecoin side, how do I know that I've in fact received my Litecoin at the end of the day, and therefore am comfortable with the fact that I have sent my Bitcoin away and can't get it back? Does that make sense?
Great question, Craig. This is achieved with two separate pieces that sort of work together. First off, when you send your Bitcoin into THORChain, you see a real regular Bitcoin address. And when you send your Bitcoin to that Bitcoin address, whatever client you're using, whatever app that is, whatever wallet you're using to send the Bitcoin, would add a memo or an op return to that Bitcoin transaction. And encoded in that Bitcoin transaction is the address where you want to receive the Litecoin, and also a limit price. When the second half of that, so first half is that transaction that you send into THORChain. The second half is how THORChain processes the transactions. And it's very similar to how the old Shapeshift used to work, where if there's anything that went wrong, it will bounce the funds back to wherever they came from. But if everything goes right, then the swap will go through and the settlement coin, the Litecoin, will arrive at the specified address. If you specify a limit price that is way above or below market, like it doesn't make sense. You're trying to trade one Litecoin for one Bitcoin. We know that one Litecoin should not give you one Bitcoin. Your one Litecoin will be returned with a small transaction fee taken out of it. So in that respect, it's very similar to Shapeshift. The old Shapeshift, I should say.
Okay, so it's THORChain that's keeping track of the fact if the exchange actually did occur. So if instead of asking for a Litecoin, I ask for a Ron Paul coin. I don't even know if that chain is still being maintained, right? So I've got my Bitcoin now locked up in an address that's controlled by the THORChain protocol. At some point, the Bitcoin blockchain needs to know whether I need to get my Bitcoin back, or if the swap had actually occurred as intended, at which point I'm okay with my Bitcoin going to its recipient because I've received the exchange of the asset that I was looking for in the first place. How does, or I guess who is broadcasting back to the Bitcoin blockchain, yes or no, this off-chain transaction that was intended to occur actually did occur, so that the Bitcoin blockchain knows what course of action to take next?
Yeah, so in terms of THORChain knowing that the outbound transaction happened and it sent out the Litecoin that you're looking for, when it actually does a swap, it sees the inbound transaction of the Bitcoin, and it doesn't actually mark the transaction as complete until it actually observes the outbound transaction on the Litecoin network to the address that's specified. So it actually monitors every wallet that is in the system, and it knows anytime funds go in, and it knows every time the funds go out, and it uses that information to know that this transaction is now completed. We have now received the Bitcoin, and we've sent out the Litecoin. Everything has been, requested as such. If there's some reason that something went wrong, like maybe the memo that you used to send in the information, but like you sent us say you sent us an ETH address instead of a Litecoin address, for example, it's something invalid. The network would observe that and would say, oh, they sent us, an ETH address instead of a Litecoin address. It doesn't make any sense. This whole transaction is kind of null and void to some degree. So let's just go ahead and refund this person back their Bitcoin, minus a small fee for wasting our time. And here you go. Here's your Bitcoin back to the original address that you sent to.
There's another piece to it as well. For anybody who's in the audience that joined the last scheduled talk that Chad, John, and I participated in about Cosmos, you may remember what Cosmos is and how Cosmos works. THORChain is built on the Cosmos SDK, so it inherits a lot of the math and the consensus protocols from Cosmos. And when Chad was saying that THORChain monitors this and THORChain monitors that, he's talking about THORChain as if it's an entity, but we have to remember that THORChain is a collection of many validator nodes that are operating around the world by many independent people. Right now, in the testing version of THORChain, there are, I believe, 36 nodes, but in the future multi-chain version, there will be 100 or maybe even more. Each of these nodes independently run their own copy of the entire Bitcoin blockchain and the entire Litecoin blockchain and the entire Ethereum blockchain and any other blockchain that's connected to THORChain. They have to, because they need to be able to independently observe what is happening on all of the connected chains. So when an individual node observes the Bitcoin transaction coming in, they add their digital signature and commit it to the THORChain blockchain, saying, as of this block, I assert that this Bitcoin transaction came in. When all 36 nodes have done that, there's consensus. Actually, because it's over Cosmos, you don't need all 36 nodes to do that. You just need a majority of them to do that. Once there's consensus amongst all the independent observers, then one of those independent nodes will be chosen based on an algorithm. Let's say it's node number 5. Node number 5, you now need to send 5 Litecoin out to that address. And node number 5 will send 5 Litecoin out of its own treasury. Each of the nodes involved that are observing all of these chains, they have their own tiny little vaults. There's the big vault that Chad mentioned earlier that's run by threshold signatures that holds the bulk of all Bitcoin and the bulk of all Litecoin and the bulk of all Ether in the system. But then each individual node runs a tiny little vault to send out the outgoing transaction for every swap. So in Craig's example, let's say 0.05 Bitcoin is sent into the THORChain vault, the big one. When all 36 nodes have observed, yes, the Bitcoin really did arrive and the THORChain decentralized system received the Bitcoin, then node number 5 will be tasked with sending a 5 Litecoin outgoing transaction to Craig. Once all the 36 nodes see that node number 5 successfully sent it out, then everything's done and everybody's happy.
Okay, if that node does not send it out, do one of the other nodes pick up the slack and actually do it themselves?
Here's where it gets fun.
If one of the nodes if that node number 5 doesn't send out the funds as requested by the network will observe that they didn't do their action. I think it's after about 300 blocks, which is about 25 minutes or so. The network says, okay, this guy, we asked him to send out the funds and he's just not doing it for whatever reason. So we're going to go ahead and slash his bond that he used to join the network. So he got punished for doing so. And it's going to fall back to the larger, more slow, but much more secured vaults, the threshold signature vaults. And say, okay, let's just fall back to the Asgard vaults and say, all right, let's go ahead and resend or reschedule this transaction with the Asgard vaults to send the Litecoin to Craig. Now, if Craig's or if the node 5 box wakes up later on and for some reason, somehow the code doesn't do this, but if for some reason, somehow it decides to send out the funds anyway and double send out the funds, then that would be considered a slash on that node because they sent out funds they weren't allowed to send out, even though they were allowed to send in the beginning. And they timed out after 300 blocks, 25 minutes. And so they do it by 30 minutes or 35 minutes, they get slashed 1.5x, whatever the amount of money they sent out. So if it was $100 worth of Litecoin, they get slashed $150 from their bond. And that bond is basically placed into the Litecoin pool to replace the funds that they effectively had stole from the network. So the liquidity providers are made whole again by that slashing.
Okay, you pointed out something that is one of the fears of mine when it comes to trying to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish here, and that is that the nodes are running the full version of the Bitcoin blockchain, the Litecoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, etc., and you're imposing a very high computational cost to the node operators that are there. One thing we actually realized at Mastercoin very early on was the speed of parsing that's required to do, we had meta layer transactions on top. Counterparty was another example of a meta layer processing protocol that was built on top of Bitcoin, and I believe their initial implementation was in Python. What we found out was happening is that as new blocks were coming in and didn't need to be parsed, the Python implementation of Counterparty wasn't actually fast enough to complete finishing the parsing of the metadata in the block by the time the next block came in. And so we had a similar problem with the first implementation of Mastercoin, which is why we actually went to a C++ implementation to piggyback on top of Bitcoin Core to make sure that we had enough time to process the logic of all of the transactions by the time the next block came in. Now, you're imposing on the node operators of Thor a very high computational cost, which is they have to maintain the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, the EOS blockchain, the Litecoin blockchain. Every blockchain that it wants to be a part of the THORChain network now has a node requirement that exists that can, in fact, validate that what's supposed to happen is happening. And my fear is that over time, as those blockchains continue to grow in size, which they do, the computational and storage requirements for every node continues to increase, which means that your initial set of nodes, so long as they started early enough in the process and had begun parsing from the very beginning and are in effect caught up at that point, they may very well have a lesser concern of staying up to date. But if any new participant wanted to join the network as a node, as a validator for Thor, they would then have to basically start up every one of those blockchains from scratch, begin the parsing of all those blockchains from scratch, and get themselves caught up. And my fear is that from a computational requirement, eventually there is going to be so much data on each of these blockchains that it will be infeasible or impossible for a new node to come on board and be able to catch themselves up by the time the network is in its contemporary and current state. So
I'd love to address that.
Please.
And after I address that, I want to go back and add to something that Chad answered with the last question. But first, to your absolutely great concern. There's a big difference between what THORChain is doing with all of its blockchains that are being observed and what Omni and Counterparty both were doing. Omni and Counterparty were encoding a bunch of extra data and adding that into individual Bitcoin transactions and Litecoin transactions that needed to be processed separately. And it totally makes sense that that extra processing over and above what Bitcoin is doing would need to be parsed separately and would take a lot of extra time. Where THORChain differs is that the swap logic is handled completely by different systems and is not handled by the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain or the Litecoin blockchain. In each of those cases, it's just a regular Ethereum transaction arriving at an address, and it's a regular Bitcoin transaction arriving at a Bitcoin address. So all the Bitcoin node needs to do is keep up with the Bitcoin blockchain, and all that the Ethereum node needs to do is keep up with the Ethereum blockchain. There are companies that run dozens of these blockchain daemons without any issue today, and THORChain node operators would be.
I'm
Okay.
glad Craig brought this up because this is exactly what I had written down. You know, I think you and Chad have both kind of said it as it's like this easy thing or like this, yes, you just watch all the chains, but there's, it's difficult to ingest that much block data. And like, I guess Craig is saying, parse it to say, okay, what are the addresses I care
You're right,
about?
but if you allow me to finish, you don't have to ingest and parse these transactions in the same way that, let's say, Shapeshift would need to ingest all the Bitcoin transactions into an indexed database of things. What the nodes need to do is look at the current Bitcoin transactions that are arriving and look at the current Litecoin transactions that are going out. And there's a fairly narrow window, as long as they are caught up and they're fully synced with the Litecoin and Bitcoin chains. They only need to observe one coming in and make sure that one is going out. There's very little parsing involved. The op return data or the memo data added on the various chains that are sending THORChain swaps that data is very simple and doesn't need a lot of processing in order to handle. And because they don't need to be indexed, and they only need to look at current state, it's very easy for an existing Thor node to stay up to date and parse these. Sorry, and transmit these.
But it's true there's not extra data to be parsed, but there is still processing power required to validate that the outputs that are necessarily available or the balance that is available on the sender's chain is in fact available to be sent to the intended recipient and recorded on THORChain as such. So this becomes sort of diving into the computer science parlance, but a big O problem. It seems like the node operators' requirements are like end to the end, where the more blockchains that are being added to the THORChain network, the computational requirements are growing exponentially. And it's like it could be like end to the end to the end, like as bad as you can possibly imagine. The larger it grows. I'm curious, how does it contain itself? What is the big O profile for a THORChain?
So it's more linear, right? So none of these THORChains actually need to parse all of history. They only care about the tip, and because the history has been parsed by previous nodes and previous history. So if you're a new node coming in, you want to run validator node and join the network, you don't need to parse through everything that ever happened in Bitcoin or Ethereum or Litecoin or these things. All you need to do is look at the last block height that network is already scanned and validated, which we'll just say it's block height 10,000, and start from that point, which is the current tip of whatever blockchain it is. We have within the team, we've run these nodes with 4 or 5 or 6 different chains without a problem whatsoever. It takes actually almost no time at all. The actual cost to run a node right now is approximately about $1,000. The amount of money that it produces right now, and this is while it's overbuying, by which is much less than it would normally be, but it's $30,000 a month to run a node. That's money that you earn running a node, and $1,000 a month to actually cost to run a node. The differential between how much it costs to run a node and how much it runs a node is humongous. It really means nothing. And if we wanted to add, say, the chain, so the network or the team or the community rather want to add, Zcash and add Monero and add these other things, the computational need is actually quite minimal. There's a lot of disk space for however large that particular chain might be, but in terms of cost of operation, it's actually rather simple. I could easily see a situation where the network could have 20, 30 chains, whatever. The THORChain itself is actually generally guided towards the short tail and not the long tail. You're not going to be able to trade 10,000 different coins in this network. It's not intended for that purpose. It's more intended for maybe the top 100, maybe the top 1,000 economically significant chains and coins that are out there in the world.
But hold on. I'm with you there. The question though is a decentralized network. There's a governance component where who's to stop the 10,000th chain from coming along saying, I want to be a part of the THORChain network, and some node operator decides to pick that up or not pick that up. Who's in charge?
Before we ask a new question, one other piece of the last question that I think will help put into perspective, because I brought this exact same concern that you had, Craig, to the THORChain developers. I don't remember which moniker it was, whether it was Heimdall or some other Norse mythological name. But the answer that was given to me was that at first there's going to be just single nodes and on a single THORChain. Maybe there's going to be 8, 10, 15, 20. At some point when that hits a upper bound of processing power or disk space and the cost for these node operators to run, the THORChain can be splintered out so that there are like multiple separate THORChains, and you could be a validator on one, a validator on the other, and they would all connect to each other using Cosmos's IBC, so that effectively they're all running one network. But it will be possible for node operators to not need to run every single chain, and different node operators will run on others. But this is a problem that is like 4 years out, 6 years out. Right now, just getting a multi-chain decentralized swapping network up that can swap amongst the top 10 assets has never been done before. So they're solving that problem first, and then they'll be splintering it out to others.
Okay, that kind of answered my question. The image I had in my head was Chad mentioned that it costs $1,000 to run the node, and you're going to make $30,000. You've got ample profit there to continue enlarging your node sort of perpetually. To keep up with the number of blockchains that are being used, the number of data on those blockchains as well. I had this image of like finding an asteroid full of gold, right? It will cost us $10 billion to get the rockets necessary to mine that asteroid. But when we find out the asteroid is actually the size of the Earth. So now we have as much gold as there is on the Earth. And so there's, however many quintillions worth of dollars of gold. You can't do anything with it because you can't put all that gold anywhere because it's the same size as the Earth. Like you have this gigantic thing that, yes, it's profitable enough to go get it in practice, but eventually you run out of silicon, you run out of space, you run out of power, you run out of something. It's like there is no upper bound to what the THORChain network must process in order to ensure that the transactions are valid, to the guy or the guy or girl who wants to send his Bitcoin out and get another coin in exchange. That's the one thing that's troubling me is the computational requirements going forward in the future for the node operators that allow the system to stay decentralized and not consolidate around the folks who got there first and built these gigantic data centers. Now they're sort of the arbiters of which transactions can be validated and then settled back to their original chain.
Yeah, one thing it might clear something up here is that what chains do or do not get added to the network is derived from the validators themselves. A supermajority of nodes need to come together to say, we're going to add chain Zcash, for example, or not add it, whatever. An individual chain can say, I want to add Zcash, so I'm going to start, observing it, blah, blah, blah. But it's not really actually added to the network until a supermajority of validators say, okay, we all agree that Zcash is a good chain, and we're going to add it and blah, blah, blah. Or the opposite could happen where, a supermajority of validators can say, you know what, the computational cost of running an Ethereum classic, ETC thing is, not great. And maybe the chain is insecure for some reason or whatever. I'm just making something up. And so we're going to opt to shut down this chain, in which case the network can say, we're going to shut down support for Ethereum Classic, for example, in which case that all the funds get exploded out and everybody gets their funds back who provided liquidity. Everything just gets sent out automatically through what's called a Ragnarok process. But it's in the end, it is the validator's choice as a collective to decide upon how many chains to support and which chains to support. And through that governance protocol, which has no communication whatsoever, but everybody says it has to do the thing they feel is right, will come to a realization of what is supported and what's not supported relative to the cost that it takes for a validator to run a Thor node in its entirety.
Okay. Danielle, go ahead.
I just wanted to dig a little deeper into the validators. Like, who are the ideal validators? Are they all filled already? What stage are you at with the validators right now? Sure.
So right now, what we call ChaosNet, which is a Binance-only single chain kind of proof of concept to some degree, is running. There's 36 validators that are running right now, all of which are anonymous. They're controlling, I think, like $350 million or something like this as the total value lock of that network. All that's controlled by anonymous individuals across the entire space of the entire world in a literal sense. That's never been done before. It's actually a first in crypto history that we were kind of pushing on, in a sense. Anybody can become a validator who wants to become a validator. There's no sign-up process. There's nobody to talk to. You don't have to talk to me or anybody else. It's completely anonymous and there's no KYC whatsoever. All it requires you to build the infrastructure and then bond your node with some Rune. And the validator that has the highest amount of Rune at that time at the churn events that happens every 3 days gets selected to be churned into the network and start making a profit. So it's a capitalistic market that determines how much Rune is required to be bonded to a node to be churned into the network to run and validate on the network. Currently, it's about like 1.2 million Rune, which is approximately $5 or $6 million in dollar value. And again, that's dictated by the capitalistic markets of the community as a whole, and not so much dictated by anybody individually.
Yeah,
And
it's important to note that those two cliffs that Chad mentioned, those two requirements, are both very, very high and out of reach for the average person. The computer science knowledge and development operation knowledge that you'll need to know to set up a Thor node validator would rival what our engineers at Shapeshift have to do every day, managing the dozens of chains and chain daemons that we run every day. So it's not everybody off the street that can that has that type of knowledge and experience to be able to do that effectively. And also that bond, that 1.1 million Rune bond that Chad mentioned, not everybody off the street can afford $6 million to run a node. The reason for the bond is super interesting and is a totally separate ball of wax, but I know that Danielle was about to ask something before I rudely interrupted her.
Well, I just wanted to answer Danielle's question. She had two there. One was, who's the ideal person to run a node? I think, at least in my viewpoint, and this is just my 2 cents, an exchange would actually be a great candidate, right? Like a Coinbase, for example, or a Binance, that'd be a great candidate. It does require, as Michael was saying, does require a higher degree of technical expertise. It's not like mining on Bitcoin or something like a POW where you can just come and go whenever you please. You have to orderly enter and orderly exit, or if you don't, there's a lot of money to be lost on your part. And then Daniel, you were asking another question, and I can't remember what it was, but please ask.
I just was wondering, like, is it limited to a certain amount, or it just as long as you meet those requirements that you guys said?
Oh, good question. So ChaosNet right now, it's limited to, specifically hard-coded to only allow 36 nodes in the network. The reason why that is because of the Asgard vault, the threshold signature vault. Now, there's 36 members who are maintaining that wallet with, approximately $300 million or whatever the heck it is. The more people that you get to manage, or more members of that party, if you want to call it that, because it's a quadratic relationship to the amount of time that it takes to sign a transaction. So right now it's around like 10 or 15 seconds to sign a single transaction out of that Asgard vault. So it's very secure and also very slow, right? Intentionally so. So we could scale it up to 40 nodes or 50 nodes or 60 nodes. And then by doing so, the time it takes to sign transactions just elongates more and more quadratically. That's not a good thing. So in the new network that's being launched in a few weeks, this network actually allows multiple Asgards in the same network. So each Asgard will have approximately 35, 36, maybe 40 approximately nodes in each one of these things. It's hard coded to be that amount. But it can have several of them. So it can do 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 1,000, whatever. So now at that point, it's not about the number of the members of a threshold signature that is a limiting factor to how many nodes can participate in the network. At that point, that's been eliminated. That's no longer the bottleneck. The bottleneck after that point is Cosmos itself. How many validators can Cosmos itself handle and still be able to sign blocks effectively or efficiently? THORChain's block time is about 5 seconds. According to my conversations with people over at Cosmos, like Zaki and Jack and all these great guys, they're saying it's probably around 200, 300, 400 different validators. The network will start with 100 and see how that goes and make sure it's reliable and safe and all these things. And then we'll push that limit out further and further. The more validators in the network, the better. That'll just make the system more decentralized, which is the goal here. But I don't see it going any higher than 500 just because of limitations of the Cosmos protocol itself underneath it.
Let's have definition time, because Chad, you used a couple of words there that the audience may not be familiar with. You used the word Asgard. And Asgard is the name for the very large but very slow-moving vault that is shared by all of the validators. There's also, I mentioned smaller vaults that each individual node operator runs themselves. Those small vaults are called Yggdrasil vaults. The Asgard is the big one, the Yggdrasil is the small one. These two words come from Norse mythology, and as you start diving deeper into THORChain, a lot of Norse mythology comes out. And as one other illustrative thing, if any of you are by a computer where you can type in a URL to visually see what we're talking about, I'd encourage you to open up a new tab in your browser and go to thorchain.net/nodes, or just go to thorchain.net and click nodes at the top. This will list you all of the active nodes. There are 36 computers around the internet right now that are the current 36. And you can see below that list, there's a bunch of standby nodes. These are computers that are ready to become active and ready to start helping, but they're not in the active set. Every 2 days, a churn happens. A churn is when some of the active nodes drop out of the active set and some of these standby nodes take their place. This regular churning of the active set makes sure that no individual person can ever get full control of the Asgards, and it gives every active node an opportunity to have a little bit of downtime to install upgrades and things like that. Definition time over.
Okay, cool. Something that was a very good definition. I didn't realize that the vaults actually had that hierarchy. And then Chad mentioned that at some point we're going to have multiple Asgard, so it'll be like a meta Asgard network. And I'm assuming when that gets too large, we can have multiple meta Asgard networks and have a meta Asgard storage, etc. You mentioned something earlier about how new chains join the network and how the super validators, the validators, then come together with a supermajority to approve a new chain being added. And that brings into the question of the sort of the human off-chain governance mechanism that exists to do that. So for example, tomorrow I invent some new blockchain and it's the best thing since sliced bread.
Craig coin.
Craig, I would never do that, but sure.
Sell it to us, sellers.
Yeah, right. So Craig coin gets created tomorrow and I say, I want to be a part of THORChain. Now, if I have to get a supermajority of the validators to agree that it's a good idea, does that not incentivize me to bribe those node operators off chain, separately in the human governance world, in order to get my new chain put into this network? Is there
Who are you going to bribe, Craig?
At some point I'm going to know who some of the node operators are, I assume.
Name one.
And as long as you have one and they have an incentive, they're going to know somebody else. I mean, these things do eventually create networks of reputation offline. So at some point, somebody's going to know somebody. And my question is do you see what I'm saying? Is does that not encourage corruption on some level?
So this is one of the reasons why the network really believes in the idea of anonymous nodes. There's no contact information. There's no hangouts. There's no brunch together on Sundays. Nothing like this. That actually happens on the Atom network, unfortunately, and that allows people to cohese and collude and potentially do all these things that's not actually good for the network in a sense. But THORChain, every node is just completely anonymous as a Bitcoin user on Bitcoin. So all you know about the person is a particular THORChain address, and that's basically all the information that you have of the person for the most part. Being able to bribe somebody requires communication, which that'd be hard to accomplish. But even if you were to do that, let's just say that you were able to expose all the validators of THORChain and say, I know who everybody is somehow, some way. I don't know how you accomplish that, but just say you did. You'd have to bribe them some amount of money to run add a new chain to a system that will probably not be economically beneficial. Because if it's economically beneficial, you probably don't need to bribe them. They'll just add it anyway because it makes sense for the coin. It makes sense for the network. They'll make more money if they add the chain. But if they're not going to make more money to add the chain, they're going to, and they don't have that incentive by itself, and you're going to do it purely on bribery, then I don't know how that would work, because you'd probably spend more money bribing them than it would make sense, to be honest with you.
Okay, just from a corrupt businessman's bootstrapping perspective, I would imagine that could be a feasible means of trying to get themselves onto the network. I like your answer, though, that if the network has enough merit on its own that would be economically feasible, it would be added anyway. I think that's probably the best answer there to play that game theory out, which is good. But in terms of anonymity, eventually, again, you have large node operators that have a increasing demand on processing power, which means they could very well be anonymous, but you're still going to have servers sitting in a room somewhere consuming power and real estate, and those things don't go unnoticed. So the anonymity of the node operators, as the computational requirements continue to increase, becomes less physically anonymous, because at some point there are servers somewhere consuming power, and that is registered to a business or an individual, and that's, again, not easy to hide.
Right, but even in your hypothetical situation of bribing everybody to add, Craig chain or whatever it might be, it actually has no real harm to the network as a whole. Like it doesn't actually affect anybody. You just add a chain that probably nobody really cares about, and it'll have almost no liquidity in the pool and almost no swaps going through it. Therefore, not producing any revenue. Therefore, nobody's staking in it. The economics of the system would probably push that system out anyway, but it'd be unlikely situation. But it is an interesting idea to think about.
Okay, yeah, as the hypothetical corrupt businessman, which I'm not, thank God, I could see that being an incentive that needs to be dismissed. For the network to stay pure and to have both technical viability as well as ethical viability, it needs to account for whoever the potential corrupt businessman is who wants to sort of play that game out. And if the system fails because of the possibility of corruption, that needs to be addressed on a human governance level, as well as on a technical governance level.
Hey, do you mind if I jump in with one question, Michael?
Absolutely. I mean, no, I don't mind. Absolutely, I don't mind. Yes, you can ask the question. Damn it.
All right, I'm going to go ahead. Chad, so we're talking a lot about these like various adding of assets, and this conversation about the computational power to support all these blockchains is a very good one. And it got me thinking about just the universe of blockchains, in that I don't necessarily think that there will need to be an infinite number of blockchains supported by THORChain, but there may need to be an infinite number of assets on those blockchains. So something like Ethereum, Binance Chain, a lot of these, they have all these various tokens that live on them, and those could be thousands and thousands of assets. And it's likely there will be a few blockchains that support a large amount of tokens. There'll also be a lot of blockchains, but there won't be as many blockchains needed as there will be assets. How does it work, Chad, when you're scaling these things across all those assets of like a particular chain? Like, is there a problem if you add more than 1,000 ERC20s or 100,000 ERC20s, or does that computationally and the rest not scale as bad, and that that's something the nodes can handle? But can you speak to that, because the assets get a lot more infinite than the chains themselves?
Sure. Yeah, so on your example of ERC20, technically it actually doesn't matter. There's no increase cost computationally for the network in that particular chain, but that's not true for all chains. Like Binance Chain, for example, each individual asset has to be managed individually. So when there's a churn event, for example, and the network is removing some nodes from the network and adding some nodes to the network, that happens every few days. A new Asgard wallet is created in that churn event, and all the old Asgard vault that has all the funds in it effectively gets key signed as transactions, and then signed over and sent over to the new Asgard vault. Like, actually moving funds continuously throughout the network, and you can actually go see the history of the KSNets, all that vaulted has managed in the past. So there is a computational cost that the network has to kind of endure for each one of those, Binance Chain assets, for example. That's partially why the network in its current form only supports 100 different coins. That's not really a hard limit, other than just a configuration option that's in the code, which can easily be changed by the network if they choose to change it later on. They can increase it to 200 or 300 or 1,000, whatever they feel like is, makes sense. But I would say, though, that to your point, though, is that how many coins actually have significant economic value in crypto? I mean, is it 100? Is it 1,000? I mean, I think most of us here could probably think of maybe 20 coins that are actually really, viable or have real significant economic significance behind them. So this is not going to be a long tail system like UniSwap or SushiSwap is, where you can have 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 assets in it. It's intended to be more short tail and cover the most important, most economically significant things. So if you want to go to some sort of long tail asset, some edge case, shitcoin on Ethereum, for example, you can swap from Bitcoin to, let's just say, Tether, which is a good example, and then swap that Tether to that shitcoin via SushiSwap or UniSwap, or one of those other decentralized exchanges that are designed for the long tail use case. THORChain is just really focused on, let's just get the main economic powerhouses out there, which will probably be around 20 chains and maybe 100 assets or maybe 200 assets. We'll see how the community decides to lead this in the future, because it certainly won't be me or anybody else that's currently involved in the team. And we'll see how that happens.
That raises a very good question, Chad. So there's a distinction when it comes to assets and tokens on blockchains between the protocol tokens themselves, which act as spam mechanisms for the blockchains themselves, like Bitcoins on the Bitcoin network, Ether on the Ethereum network. But then you have the meta coins, the Tether on Omni. You've got ERC20 on Ethereum. You've got the different token issuance mechanisms that exist on different blockchains. How does Thor account for the protocol tokens on a chain versus the meta tokens that are issued on those chains? So, for example, if I have Tether on Omni that I want to move on the THORChain, and I want to swap that out for Tether on ERC20 on the Ethereum blockchain, how is Thor able to keep track of that meta token issuance that's one layer higher than the core protocol tokens of that blockchain itself?
Yeah, sure. So the THORChain network has this thing called this daemon called Bifrost. It's one of the daemons that you have to run if you're running a validator of this network. And that Bifrost's job is to monitor all the external chains, whether it be, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Binance, Litecoin, whatever it might be. It has to have the chain specific knowledge of how to interact and operate and understand individual coins and assets and how transactions happen, and how many confirmations do we have to wait until we make an observation on this POW chain. All this kind of chain specific knowledge happens within that Bifrost daemon. THORChain itself is actually completely agnostic. It doesn't actually know or care about whether a chain is on a coin is on this chain, or whether it's an ERC20, or whether it's non-ERC20, or whether it's this or that. It's all treated identically the same. It has no real understanding that anything is one coin is any different than the other, with the exception of gas coins adds a little layer of complexity, but not very significantly. So the THORChain network itself handles ERC20s and ETH and everything else identically. It sees them no different from anything else, and that's worked perfectly fine. What does need to understand the complexity is that Bifrost system. That kind of has that chain specific knowledge. So there's a little module built for each individual chain in Bifrost, which you can do to build one for Zcash and build one for Monero and build one for Ripple or whatever you want to do. And so it actually has to understand the differences between a layer 1 token like Ethereum and a smart contract based token like an ERC20. But it has to break down that information and say, I saw this token on this network from this address, this amount being sent to that address with this memo, and has a standard uniform struct, if you want to call it that, that it kind of transmits to the THORChain network and says, this is what's happening. It handles it all the same from the network side, but Bifrost understands intricacies of each individual chain, if that makes sense.
One fun aspect of that I'll add on is it's a novel little standard that someone in the THORChain ecosystem came up with. I don't know who, but my hat tips to you. Naming assets. If you've ever tried to look for Bitcoin on multiple separate exchanges, some of them call it BTC, some of them call it XBT, and a few other things. And it becomes a nightmare, especially when a project upgrades its symbol, like what happened with DAI and Psi and all that nonsense. What someone in the THORChain ecosystem built was a standardized naming system that I really like. It's chain.token. So BTC.BTC is the Bitcoin token on the Bitcoin chain. But you can also have Eth.WBTC, which denotes the Bitcoin token on the Ethereum chain. Both of them could be Bitcoin, but because you're denoting chain.token, it makes it a lot easier to know exactly what you're talking about. And then the agnostic THORChain system can receive these token symbols from Bifrost as it's doing its thing, and it really doesn't matter what that token is. It'll be able to parse it and know where it is.
Okay, so from a meta perspective, you'd have like bitcoin.omni.usdt, you'd have bitcoin.counterparty.rarepepe versus Ethereum.ERC20 token versus Ethereum.ERC721 token versus the Tezos.whatever. Is that how the namespace expands?
Yeah, it's pretty much comprised of a chain and an asset. An asset is comprised usually of a symbol or a ticker. We wouldn't get too much in the weeds here, but basically, no, it's good. I remember having that conversation of creating that that naming schema. But yes, it is designed in that way to be able to differentiate between a tether token on Bitcoin and a tether token on Binance and a tether token on Ethereum. It can see and observe them as separate entities entirely.
So I'd like to take us a little different route for a bit, if that's okay. We've talked a lot about how it works in the under the hood, but I think myself and I'm sure people in the audience, how can they use it? Like, you're launching soon. Like, how can they access this? Can an average crypto user come in day one and trade?
Yeah, sure.
Provide liquidity or
Yeah, sure, of course. So right now, ChaosNet is the only real network in the sense of real assets. So you can go there to chaosnet.bepswap.com. That's the website you can use. There are other websites you can go to. I think Asgard.exchange or something like that is one of them that's built by the community. You know, we as a team, we do offer a UI that you can use, but you don't have to use it. Anybody else can create a UI. Some exchanges are looking into integrating THORChain into the exchange itself, or some wallets we know are actually doing the work to integrate THORChain into the wallet itself natively. So I think for right now, there are some UIs, and we actually have our own wallet that's being released. Actually, it already is released technically. You can download for free. It's all open source and available. Cross-chain wallet. It's actually really nice, really well designed. But I think in the future, I think what's really going to happen is whatever wallet you do use, whatever exchange you do use, whatever interface you like to use, THORChain will probably be integrated into that natively, and you can just go ahead in my wallet and say, I have Bitcoin and I want Ethereum. Click, click, done.
And it's also important to note that like this is how you're going to use it, but THORChain is only going to be useful to a subset of all crypto users. If you want to trade your local currency, like US dollars, Canadian dollars, whatever that is, into Bitcoin, you're probably going to have to use your centralized exchange, and THORChain won't be as useful to you. Also, if you're a high frequency trader and you want to zip back and forth between assets to time the buy low, sell high, and you're a high frequency trader, THORChain is not going to be useful to you either. THORChain is useful to people who already have one of the major economic assets and they want to have another major economic asset, and they don't want to use a centralized exchange for the custodial risks or the KYC privacy issues, and they don't have a need to necessarily do it fast. We know that Bitcoin blocks take 10 minutes, and we know that other chains have long periods of time as well. So for those people who just need one in, one out, THORChain is perfect. But there will still be a need for the UniSwaps and SushiSwaps, decentralized protocols on other chains, and there will still be a need for centralized exchanges as well.
For sure.
I note that we are just over the halfway mark. Now may be a good time to invite anybody from the audience who's been listening to the conversation between the five of us up here and have their own questions about what THORChain is, or whether it be a non-technical question or a technical question. I'm going to invite Todd on stage.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, my question has to do with, how can, maybe you can all talk about what THORChain and the blockchain ecosystem will empower, thanks to being able to swap between these various tokens and blockchains more easily.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so for me, when I think about Bitcoin, just for 1 second, as a segue to answer your question, Bitcoin to me, one of the most important things about it is, as I see it, as a movement in civil rights, a movement in the fact that you can own your own wealth without the need of any kind of third party being involved. It becomes an inalienable human right. Bitcoin itself is literally, the way I see it, to be an inalienable human right, because it's something that you can have that can never be taken away from you by anybody, anywhere, anytime in the world ever. That is a monumental movement. That means that a human right has been given to the entire world, no matter what side of an imaginary line that you happen to be born on. That's never been done before in history, from my perspective. That's absolutely astounding. And I think THORChain is kind of following that example and saying, not only can you hold your own assets and hold your own wealth and as you want to, but it's also now saying that you can move your wealth and from asset A to asset B, whatever that might be, without the requirement of some sort of third party to be involved. Because as you know, like blockchains today are all isolated islands. That you really can't go from one chain to the other for the most part without going some third party centralized entity of some kind. And that might be Coinbase, that might be Kraken. And that might even be a Ren protocol, which is actually not decentralized at all, for that matter, right? So a lot of these things aren't even really decentralized, because guess what? It's actually really hard to go cross-chain decentralized. We know that quite well. But this is what makes it so significant. This addition to the crypto community is that you have the ability to move between chains without going through some centralized entity, and that's going to be completely game-changing. That's going to create highways between these islands in a way that's going to reshape crypto entirely, from my perspective.
Yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think THORChain will do more for Bitcoin than any other project that I know of that is being built on Bitcoin today. And I know there's a lot of really cool stuff being built on Bitcoin. So I realize the magnitude of that statement. Bitcoin was built as a way to be inclusive for everybody. Anybody, whether you lived in this country or that country, whether you had this many dollars or that many dollars, everybody could use Bitcoin. But unfortunately, over the years, shackle after shackle has been added onto Bitcoin in the terms of this regulatory environment in this country, or this monetary requirement in that country. And today, it's very difficult to deal with Bitcoin without giving up loads of your privacy and everything. THORChain removes all those shackles. THORChain allows Bitcoin to achieve what Satoshi Nakamoto probably originally intended, a completely open, uncensorable economic model. And before THORChain existed, the only real way that you could buy and sell Bitcoin is to use these centralized gatekeepers. And that means you have to follow whatever rules each of these centralized gatekeepers decides to impose. THORChain removes those gates, and that's why I think it's super important for Bitcoin, probably the most important project for Bitcoin to come out since Bitcoin itself.
Yeah, just to add to that, THORChain is really building a DeFi platform and DeFi applications that are chain agnostic, that are asset agnostic. That includes Bitcoin. You really don't have any options if you want to do DeFi on Bitcoin. You have to, in order to do that, you have to get on some sort of way of kind of bridging to Ethereum to get some sort of pegged asset on Ethereum, then jump into, SushiSwap or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And that's just not really supporting Bitcoin itself. It's just kind of faking it to some degree. And THORChain is actually saying, no, Bitcoiners should be treated as a first-class citizen. They should have access to pretty much any kind of DeFi application that they want to have access to, swapping back and forth, lending, whatever you think of. It should have that access to it no matter what chain you're on. And I think this is going to be the big revolution we're going to see in DeFi soon. It's getting away from the ETH-specific, ETH-centric kind of pick this horse as the sole winner of DeFi and say, you know what, DeFi should be available to every chain, every asset. It doesn't really matter.
Thanks for your question, Todd. Blake, you're up.
Hey, so I'm still learning about THORChain, so bear with me here. But this is a question for Michael and the Shapeshift team. You guys are running a DEX aggregator, so you're probably thinking long-term about where your volumes might come from, and you might be a little bit more impartial on this. So I'm thinking big picture. Assuming THORChain works and it unlocks cross-chain liquidity and cross-chain DeFi with good value accrual for the people who use it, what role do you see a single chain DEX playing in the long run? Like a year or 2 years from now, how are these Ethereum-based single chain DEXs like UniSwap and SushiSwap going to compete with something that brings everything to the fold?
Danielle, you've had so much experience with Shapeshift over the years. Do you want to take first crack at this answer?
I was just thinking that, we discussed how there's going to be this economic value of like a small amount of coins most likely on THORChain, or like a not the thousands and thousands you see on the Uniswaps. And I think Chad basically convinced me that, I think they're both going to have their place. I think that, well, one, of course, at Shapeshift, we love anything decentralized. But the really interesting things that you hear about so many coin requests, like people want us constantly, can you add this? Can you do this? Can you do that? So I actually think that, there's a place for THORChain. There's a place for the Uniswaps, SushiSwaps, all those out in the market. There's just so many coins, and there's definitely a need for it. yeah, that's what I'll add. Michael, you can add to that as well.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
I'll just add on real quick because that's a good question. From my perspective, and I think from a lot of Shapeshift's perspective, we are fine with integrating, and from our perspective, and let me back up for a second. Shapeshift is not, even though we have a bunch of shapeshifters here who are interested in this topic, we are not integrated with THORChain today, or don't know if we ever will. We do find it an interesting project. At the same time, we did just launch this service where we plug directly into Dexes, and we did that for a large part to get away from the kind of in the middle part of this. We've realized that these Dexes are growing at a very torrent rate, and that they're getting better and better and more useful, and that they in many ways offer a better service than we are ever going to be able to, and we want to support that because it's ultimately kind of what Shapeshift's vision always has been as well. But at the same time, when we first built Shapeshift, we couldn't really accomplish that. So like today, when you use Shapeshift, it's not so much that we're almost like a layer above an OX, or rather a DEX aggregator. Something like OX, which we use to plug in to deliver DEX exchanges and aggregate those. We're really for a world of a proliferation of these things, that for every useful decentralized exchange we can find, we'll want to plug it in and offer it to our users. And that's, so from us, the proliferation of these things, I think, are great. And like Danielle said, there will likely be a place for a number of these that solve different types of problems.
Alan, you're up. And thanks for the question, Blake.
Awesome. Yeah, guys, thank you so much for lending your time and your expertise here. I had a question, and apologies if this is simple or if you covered this earlier. I did join a little ways into the conversation. But you mentioned briefly, actually just now in the last answer, and then before, how THORChain will likely focus on the fat head, so to speak, and not the long tail of thousands of other assets listed on places like UniSwap. I'm curious if you could speak to the economics behind that decision. Why wouldn't THORChain open up? What are the pros and cons of staying exclusive to the fat head, so to speak, as opposed to opening up to the long tail?
Sure. So that's really a question for the community, rather than like the quote unquote core team, that it's going to be controlled by the community in the near future. So how many coins and how many chains and all these questions will eventually be solved by the community as a whole to decide about how many that will be. Now, what goes into the calculus of how many coins and such? Well, it depends upon the cost of maintaining these assets. All right, so every time a new pool is created on the network, that comes with it some level of cost to the validators to maintain the security of those assets, to ensure that they are secure themselves and they don't get stolen and all these things, as well as they get moved around as they need to get moved down from Asgard to Yggdrasil, back to Asgard, and all these movements, which has a cost to it, because not just computationally, but also gas-wise too, right? How much gas does it cost on Ethereum to move some, crappy, insignificant token that has a cost to the network as a whole to do so? And so the community as a whole needs to decide, what is that kind of cutting off line, right? There's a diminishing returns that the network would get by adding more and more coins. So there's got to be at some point a line that's going to be drawn in the sand by the community itself to decide upon what that is. I think the team has not decided, but just kind of set as a starting standard of 100 coins. But that can easily be changed in a literally one-line change of code to increase that to 150 or 1,000 or 10,000. It's really up to the community to decide what that is. I really don't know the answer. I'll be actually curious to see what the community thinks as a whole.
How does one, Chad, go about, like, if someone wanted to effectively petition the THORChain network to add a coin request? What Danielle talks about, we've gotten these at Shapeshift our entire existence. So many we cannot handle the thousands of add the token asset. How does one even engage with the THORChain community to basically try to convince them to add a particular asset?
Sure. For assets, how that works is, say I created a new Ethereum ERC20 token called Chad token, and I want that to be added to the network. What I would do is I would add liquidity into a pool, and I would create a new pool in the network that's called a bootstrap pool or a staged pool. And that means that people can add and remove liquidity at will, but you can't actually swap with it yet. You can't actually move liquidity through it. You can just say, I want to add liquidity, I want to remove liquidity from that particular pool. every 3 days, the network kind of wakes up and says, okay, let's do a pool churn. Let's see what's up. And so if there are, it looks to see if there's any economically significant pools relative to the pools that are already in the system. So say the limit is 100 pools, let's just say 100 coins. And the network wakes up and says, okay, now there's these 100 standby pools that are kind of sitting off to the side, not waiting to be kind of like fully official available pools so we can actually do swapping and use the pool as it's intended to be. And it says, okay, well, the smallest coin that's currently available is got 1,000 Rune tokens in that pool in terms of its depth. But this other token, this other pool now has 1,100. Okay, so that's a way of the community decides as a whole of which one of these assets is more economically significant by the depth of these individual pools. And so it manages that based upon the depth of the pools predominantly. When you do have a pool that is staged, that is not kind of churned into the network quite yet, every time that pool is not selected to be churned in, some of the Rune is taken out of the pool as a cost to maintain that pool in the system. And I think that goes into the reserve, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. And so it kind of drains the Rune slowly over a very small amount, very slowly over time to make sure that people aren't just throwing funds in there and just storing it there forever. There's actually a cost to it to make sure people don't abuse the system in a sense. But when it comes down to it, the ones that are in the network, the ones that are not, comes down to the depth of the pools. The deeper the pool, the more likely it's going to be added to the network.
So is it decided what chains and coins you'll support at the beginning?
So when the new network launches, it's decided it's going to be 5 chains: Bitcoin, Ethereum, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and Binance Coin. What coins are added beyond the gas tokens, which are the primary tokens of those things, is decided by the community as a whole. And then after that point, people can choose to add more chains, take away chains, whatever it is. The birth of it, this new chain that's going to be launching very soon, will have predetermined the initial 5 chains and initial gas assets. After that point, it's a rat race to figure out which coins will be added and to the network depending upon the depth of the pools.
Great questions all around. Thanks, Alan, for your contribution. JM, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Chad, been a big follower of THORChain for a few years now. You didn't mention it on the call today, but I know that there's plans to phase out the core team of THORChain, I believe in 2022. So kind of going off of what we were just talking about in terms of, how do you decide which chains are significant and worth adding? I'm kind of curious, since it's a decentralized project, talking about the team phasing out, what's the process for adding new chains, the difficulty of doing that, the Solanas, Terras, other chains that may not even exist, how that process will work from the technical side. I know it's taken a long time to add the 5 chains that you've mentioned to get the main multi-chain chaos net up and running. So that's my first question. And just kind of as a personal question on the side, if I'm using UniSwap or SushiSwap today, I can do that all from one wallet, an ERC20 wallet like MetaMask. But how am I going to use THORChain, to trade Bitcoin to Binance Coin to Ethereum when I don't have a single decentralized wallet that can hold all those? If I use a centralized one like Binance or Gemini or something, I can have different chains, coins. But how do I do that from one wallet? In a decentralized way?
Sure. I'll answer your first question about technical aspects of adding new chains. So adding a chain like Terra, because it's a Cosmos chain, will be relatively easy, and just because it's THORChain is a Cosmos chain, and so is Terra, and so it'll be able to use the IBC bridge. It actually won't use Bifrost itself, the thing I mentioned before. It actually will use the IBC bridge between those 2 chains as the standard that Cosmos team has set for that particular chain. So that will be any Cosmos chain would be very, very, very easy to add to the network, and actually would not require you to add more, full nodes to the network, right? You have to run a full node of Bitcoin, a full node of Ethereum and Litecoin and all the other things. But anything that's coming over via the IBC bridge, like Terra, like Kava, like Atom, those will actually do not need to run full nodes, so that will have very little cost to the network to interact in that way. For ones that are not Cosmos chain, it really depends upon the complexities of that individual chain. Have there already been chains added that are similar to it? So we had added Bitcoin first. And then Bitcoin Cash and Litecoin were very easy to add. Zcash will be pretty easy to add, I think, for the most part. I think we actually already did the code for Dogecoin. We're just not going to launch with it initially. It's like Dogecoin's actually already completed. Ethereum was a little bit complicated. Actually, was the most complicated so far. But now that Ethereum has been kind of solved, we're still working on some kinks in the moment. But it's largely already been solved. Adding Ethereum Classic, adding BSC, for example, would be pretty trivial because those two, three chains are basically identical. At least for the most part, that's true. So those would be easy. If you wanted something like Solana, something like this, that would be more complicated because it's using a proof of history system rather than proof of work or something we've used before. That'll take more time. That'll require more engineering time, months of work to do so. But once that one's added, if there's anything similar to it, you can just fork the code or copy the code from that one and just use it in this new one, making any tweaks or changes you need to make. But that'll be up to the community as a whole to do that. We'll see how it goes. But after July 2022, the core team is basically being dispersed or kind of imploded to some degree, and the project will be split into little smaller groups and teams, and the treasury will be split up in that way as well. To answer your question about cross-chain wallets, THORChain itself is actually launching a wallet called AsgardEx, which is a free open source wallet that you can use. It'll eventually have access to Ledger and Trezor and all these other hardware wallets as well, so you can use it as a UI on top of your Ledger or Trezor, or whatever you want to do. If you want to do something in browser, like you're saying MetaMask, there is a team that the THORChain team has actually invested into and funds, something called XDeFi. I think XDeFi.io, I think it is. I'll make sure I get this right. XDeFi.io, I think it is. This is a wallet that's going to be launching that is basically a cross-chain MetaMask where it can support Bitcoin and Ethereum and like every other chain out there, more or less. That all is, again, all open source based upon code that we are sharing out to the community as a whole. We believe in open source stuff. Nothing we do is closed. Everything is transparent and viewable by anybody in the world and is owned by the world in a literal sense. So it's all given out for free. We were actually very surprised. This is kind of a little side note here. We were actually very surprised. We were going to look into building a wallet and all this stuff, and we were so surprised that there really wasn't much out there that's like open source for like a cross-chain wallet. And it was just like everything's just all the wallet manufacturers for the most part are just closed source, and it's just like it was so like counterintuitive to me. Like this whole fucking community was born out of open source technology and the freeman of information. It just like it kind of grind my gears in a matter of speaking. So we made the choice to like, you know what, we're going to create a great UI, a great cross-chain wallet that'll be free and open source for the entire world to use. Here you go. Take it as you want.
And Chad, you said that the user would provide their address, right? So like you could have it, you could have your Bitcoin wallet over here and you could have your Ethereum wallet over there. That's fine. They don't need to be connected.
Correct. They don't need to be connected. If I want to swap my Bitcoin to Ethereum, I can give any Ethereum address that I choose. A wallet like AsgardEx wallet would know what your Ethereum address is and then just by default swap it to yourself, right? But if you chose like, oh, I want some with my friend, JM, for example, then I can go set some other address. But I will say that you do have to make sure that you send the transaction correctly. So Bitcoin is a very unique one. We don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but you need to send an op return, which is like a memo on Bitcoin. And the vast majority of Bitcoin wallets don't support op returns. So if any Bitcoin wallet out there wants to support THORChain to send transactions over the THORChain network, then they're going to have to add support for op return, which isn't really that hard, to be honest with you, but it's something that the wallet devs will have to add support for.
Yeah, that's going to be true for Omni as well.
For sure.
I didn't know that about the THORChain devs, and I think it's kind of poetic that they start building a decentralized system as a centralized group, only to hand over the reins and remove themselves from it. Similar to what Satoshi did, I guess, but. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Thanks for sharing that. JM, I'm sorry, I forget if you were the one who just asked that question or if you were on stage waiting for the next question.
You were the one who just asked that last question.
All right, let's invite Cole and then Tony up on stage. Tony, you made it up here first. What's your question?
Hey, yeah, I had a question about synthetics. I know THORChain's planning on adding those. I guess, are those going to be on the native THORChain tokens, and how would it work if we want to use those synthetics on the Ethereum ecosystem or on the Polkadot ecosystem? Would that be another swap and liquidity pool that people would have to provide for, or would there be some sort of native, conversion that takes place?
Yeah, so synthetics is something that's on the native THORChain chain, so to speak. It's basically, you could think of it similar to a pegged asset, and it kind of is. In some ways that's true, in some ways that's not. But basically, you can swap from basically any asset into a synthetic Bitcoin or synthetic ETH. Any pool that is available on the network, you can swap it into that thing, and it will maintain the value of a Bitcoin or maintain the value of an Ethereum. Once you have it on that network, there's all sorts of things you can do with it. You can use THORChain like a Lightning network if you want to, and be able to transact Bitcoin very quickly and efficiently, very cheaply. You can do that if you want to. You can send those synthetic assets over IBC to other protocols out there. I know some protocols like Injective, for example, which does a derivatives exchange, is interested in using THORChain synthetic assets. SIFTchain is another one that's interested in using THORChain synthetic assets. So it makes it very easy for those other DeFi apps and the Cosmos ecosystem to be able to have access to something that is valued at a Bitcoin or valued at an Ethereum or whatever other asset there is out there in the universe. That'll be pretty interesting. But using it on a synthetic on Ethereum directly, there's no method of doing that today, nor is there any plan to do that anytime soon, at least from my perspective. But somebody else could do that. Like if somebody else in the world wanted to create some sort of bridge to Ethereum using synthetic Bitcoin or something like this, then have at it. We can't stop you, nor we would necessarily really want to. But there's no plan from the core team around this idea.
Thanks for your question, Tony. Cole, you're up.
I have one question that relates to a discussion about LPing into the system, which has been one of the aspects of THORChain that I don't think has been talked about much. It's been kind of a node-centric discussion. So you might talk about that and the community rewards and the incentive pendulum particularly. And maybe after giving a rundown there, I might have another question.
Ooh, those are fun topics. I'd love to talk a little bit about the incentive pendulum. But first, one related topic that goes hand in hand is the reason for the 1 million Rune bond that each node needs to put up. Why is it so expensive? Any Bitcoin miner can just add their hardware to the network without a cost. Why does THORChain have this million Rune requirement? And the answer is sort of insurance. When all 36 of these nodes put up 1 million Rune each, there's 36 million runes as a insurance policy. Now, when all of the pools that hold all of the Bitcoin and all of the Ether and all of the Litecoin and all the other assets that are connected, when all these pools are filled up, as long as there is more bond, or more value in the bond than there is value in all the pools, the system is considered safe. If any one of the 36 node operators decides to rob their Yggdrasil vault and take some of the funds, then some of their bond gets taken from them and they don't get it back when they leave the network. Moreover, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. If they take $100 out of the vault, then $150 gets taken from their bond and given back to all of the liquidity providers in the system to make them whole, and then some. That keeps everybody in check and makes sure that they don't do anything silly while they are in partial control of all of these assets in THORChain. Now, you mentioned the incentive pendulum. Well, why are these node operators putting in these million Rune bonds? What's the point? And why are all these liquidity providers depositing their hard-earned Bitcoin and their hard-earned Litecoin into all of these pools? The answer is, well, they're a little bit greedy. Just like Bitcoin miners, for doing all the work of Bitcoin mining, they get all the new block rewards. All of the THORChain node operators and the THORChain liquidity providers, they participate in the system so that they can get money as well. And whenever a new THORChain block is mined, and whenever a tiny swap fee is taken from somebody who's swapping an asset back and forth, and even whenever nodes are slashed because they fail to observe something, all of these little rewards are added into a pool. Let's call it like the reward pie. And this reward pie is divided between the node operators and the liquidity providers. But it's not divided evenly. If I mentioned that there was insurance, that there was 36 million runes in insurance versus maybe there's only 20 million of pooled assets in all of the various pools. In that, depending on the ratio between all the pooled assets and all the bond, there will be different weightings of the rewards to either the node operators or the liquidity providers. If there's way too much liquidity in the pools and there's not enough insurance to cover it, then the incentive pendulum will swing towards the node operators to give them the bulk of all of the rewards. This incentivizes anybody from the outside looking in. Hey, look at how much more money the node operators are getting right now. I should spin up a node because I know how to and I can bond in. On the flip side, if there's way too much insurance, if there's 36 million runes worth of insurance, but there's only like 10 million runes worth of liquidity in all the pools, the incentive pendulum swings the other way and it favors all the liquidity providers. So anybody who's sitting on the sidelines, they look in and say, wow, look at how much more money the liquidity providers are getting right now. I should add my liquidity and get my share of that reward. The pendulum swings regularly back and forth between the two to incentivize all of us users to either add more liquidity or add more insurance, depending on what the system needs to keep it all in check. And that incentive alignment, I think, is a beautiful way of keeping all the parties economically vested in the future of THORChain.
And importantly, to add to that is that one of the unique designs of the THORChain network, economically speaking, is that the value of Rune itself actually is derived from the assets on the network, the BTC, the Ethereum, the Litecoin, whatever it might be. And so there's a direct relationship between those things. So you actually can't get into a situation where people start pumping just massive quantities of Bitcoin into the network and there's not enough bond to cover the liquidity added to the network. The simple act of adding Bitcoin to the network will actually increase the value of Rune and therefore keep the network economically sound, economically safe for that reason. It's pretty interesting how that's done. I don't think any other chain has done that yet. Hopefully
I'm pretty sure it's the first
it.
time I've ever seen that as well. No asset that I know of other than stablecoins can derive their value directly from something else. And yeah, if you add up every last Bitcoin, every last Litecoin, all that value, and then you divide it by however many runes there are, that is the price of Rune. Now, people will still speculate and will try to buy it for one value and sell it for a higher value. But you're then able to calculate the difference between that deterministic value of Rune and the current market rate. And that's what I see called the speculative multiplier. How much more speculation are people doing over and above what a Rune is deterministically valued at based on the assets currently secured by those Rune?
It's interesting. You could almost think about it. I'm not sure if this makes sense or not, and I'd actually be interested to hear from other people on the stage if they think this is a dumb idea or not. But you can talk about the deterministic value of Rune based upon how much Bitcoin and Ethereum is on the network. But you could also consider that to be almost like the intrinsic value of Rune, right? Because there is some sort of base value to it, some base use case. Its value does contain something else of value other than the value of the token itself. It actually has some other use case, which is basically holding these Bitcoins, holding these Ethereum, and it actually has that you could almost call it an intrinsic value to it. And then on top of that, you have the speculative kind of on top of that, how much that's worth. It's kind of a funny way to think about it in some way, at least.
I would never use that word intrinsic, but I subscribe to the theory that nothing in the universe has intrinsic value, and everything has a value because we choose to bestow that value upon the thing. But now we're getting into philosophy, which is both Craig and John's forte.
I don't know if all that satisfied Cole's question, right? But if it didn't, please, Cole, ask another one.
How'd we do, Cole?
Well, it satisfied greatly, and it talks to an aspect of the network that I think was underrepresented so far in the evening's conversation. And I'm going to add one other element to this. I'm more going to state it as opposed to ask it, but it's been for single chain ChaosNet. The pendulum has been very much in favor of the LP providers as opposed to the nodes who are working. As the two of you have observed, the nodes are making $20,000 or $30,000 a month, and it costs them $2,000 or $3,000 to operate. And everything, well, you're paid in Rune, you spend your money in US dollars or the equivalent, but there really isn't that much operational risk. An LP investor is selling Convexity, and one of the challenges I think that UniSwap or SushiSwap or all these LPs have is that the people participating in the LPs sell Convexity. In a bull market, you don't understand the cost of that. In a tough market, your LP is only as good as your worst performing token. And so inside the Rune system and inside THORChain, I think the market clears for the cost of selling Convexity. I might not be that the pendulum swings to kind of neutral from a node perspective, from a node operator's perspective. It might be that it favors the LP persistently, and I would argue that's a good thing because the nodes who are going to own so much Rune really want to capture so much value in terms of LP staking, because as you were saying, it's that LP staking that determines the deterministic value of what a Rune might be worth. So if you have comments on that, talk and give some consideration. Convexity risk is not something necessarily well understood, but it's a factor in this whole system, and I just wanted to observe that.
Great question. First, I want to call out that I disagree with one of the tiny assertions you made in the many assertions that I do agree with. And that is that node operators aren't taking much risk. If you're bonding 1.1 million Rune, which is about $6 million, and something goes wrong with your setup because of human error, because of technical error, because of network disruptions, because of so many things, your Runes are at stake. You will lose a portion of what you've bonded in. I think it was just last week that we saw some node that was operating on the network accrue some ridiculous amount of like 200,000 slash points because of, well, whatever reason, I don't know. So there definitely is risk in operating a Thor node, and that's one of the reasons why when anybody asks in the dev channel, like, "Hey, how can I do this?" I'm just trying to figure it out. So many people chime in like, "Careful, you're about to take on far more than you may be ready to chew." But other than that one tiny piece of what you said that I disagree with, everything else that you've observed is absolutely correct. For the last couple of months, at least, the incentive pendulum has been in strict favor of all of the liquidity providers. As a liquidity provider myself, I personally really like this because that means I'm getting a larger piece of that reward pie. But I see it more as the system behaving in the best interest of the system itself. Right now, there could be a lot more assets pooled in all of these pools. And if there are more assets in these pools, then when people are swapping back and forth, they receive a much more favorable rate because their swaps move the pool balance a lot less on each individual account. This is the system taking care of itself. And right now, if I were to speculate on why for so long we've seen the pendulum favoring the liquidity providers, is because it's difficult to move value onto the Binance chain. Right now, THORChain is in ChaosNet. It is not in mainnet. And everything is dealing with synthetic assets on the Binance chain. Fake Bitcoin, fake Litecoin, fake Ether, mostly because the multi-chain version hasn't been released yet. And if you want to put some of your Bitcoin into these pools, you got to get your Bitcoin onto the Binance chain. Same thing with Ether, same thing with Litecoin, same thing with everything. So, and so many countries are prohibited from using Binance and using the Binance bridge. The easiest way to get value onto that chain is to deposit into Binance.com and withdraw from Binance.com on the Binance chain instead of the real chain. And many people just can't do that. So there's an artificial barrier, a wall that you need to climb, or a moat that you need to cross to use THORChain today. When it releases in multi-chain version in a couple of weeks, apparently, according to what Chad said earlier on this call, that barrier is gone. And now anybody, anywhere in the world, without reservation, can deposit into the liquidity pools. What I would expect to see, and I can't tell the future any more than you can, but just based on my knowledge of this barrier and the fact that it's about to come down, I would expect to see in the first couple of weeks of the multi-chain network, the incentive pendulum will be swung completely in the opposite direction in favor of the node operators, because at first, the node operators will be restricted from bonding in any more than X. And that means that the pools can never grow more than X. So it's going to create an artificial scarcity. Over time, as the system seems to be operating okay, the developers will tweak the knobs and allow a little bit more and allow a little bit more, and then a true market equilibrium will be reached. But in the meantime, until the market decides the equilibrium, these developer imposed restrictions, I think, will make it far easier for many nodes to get in at a small bond while capping the pools, making the incentive pendulum very much in the node operator's favor. And as a liquidity provider myself, I'm a little bit disappointed about that, but that's just how then the pendulum swings.
Yeah, I think the fact the network has been overbonded for a while now, which is really a good thing, because it just means the assets on the network are especially secure in a sense.
More insurance.
Yeah, more insurance in a sense. So that doesn't really bother me by any such imagination. But I think part of the reason why that is because people have a thing around impermanent loss, and they freak out when it's happening, and they like just, I'm losing my money, and like kind of freak out and leave, which is kind of a trap that people can get into. Impermanent loss really isn't an issue if you're a hodler. If you stay in the network for 100 days, 200 days, something like this, you won't experience impermanent loss. Just because you're earning fees, which is always going up, you're always gaining fees. Impermanent loss itself fluctuates back and forth. This fluctuation can kind of scare people to leave a network like the THORChain, or even like UniSwap or anything else for that matter. That'll change in the next network. The next network will have impermanent loss protection. So as long as you're in the network for, I think it's a minimum 100 days, the network will actually pay for any impermanent loss that you do experience. And that's largely will be fine, because you probably won't experience impermanent loss beyond 100 days. This is how the economics fundamentally work. But I think the real reason why we see the networks overbonded, this is my 2 cents, is that it only supports one chain right now, which is Binance, which the economic value of Binance right now is like, I think like 10 billion or whatever the number is. I can't remember the last time I looked at it, but it's relatively very, very small versus all of crypto, which is like 1.3 or 4 trillion or some huge number, whatever it might be. And there's lots of speculation on the Rune token itself. So its price is kind of priced in the idea that it's going to launch a multi-chain network that allow you to swap from Bitcoin to Ethereum, and that's going to be a groundbreaking and very important service for the larger community. And so that price is priced in. That causes the value of Rune to go up very high, but the number of assets that the current network supports is relatively small. And so that's part of the reason why you see this overbonded relative to the assets in the actual network itself on ChaosNet. But I suspect, as Michael was saying a moment ago, I suspect that once multi-chain is launched and people have impermanent loss protection, and the realization that you can actually swap between chains without anybody being in the middle of it, completely peer-to-peer in a sense, is going to trigger a lot of people, especially Bitcoiners. Even Bitcoin maxis. Hell, you don't even need to own Rune or believe in Rune to actually, provide liquidity into the network. You can just send the network just Bitcoin and get more Bitcoin, stack more sats and get more Bitcoin on the other side of it. You don't even need to even have a Rune wallet. You can just do it with a Bitcoin wallet theoretically, and you can actually provide liquidity and earn more Bitcoin. So that's going to be a game changing
feature. Like, I don't think there's any other blockchain in existence. I'm pretty sure THORChain is the first to be able to claim this fact. You can use THORChain without ever touching the native token. Bitcoin maximalist would jump at the ability to make yield on their Bitcoin, but God forbid they ever touch another token. Well, with THORChain, they never have to. It's like there have been a few groundbreaking things that THORChain has done first. The largest use of a threshold signature scheme and the first blockchain system that you can use without ever touching the native token. I wonder if there are any other firsts that I'm missing there.
There's quite a few firsts, at least in my opinion, but those are a couple of them. I think the idea of a slip-based fee was, at least we're one of the first ones to implement it. I think, to my knowledge, that's true, but maybe that's not. We went through great pains to actually validate that slip-based fee model works. And it actually is much better than the XYK equation that SushiSwap and UniSwap uses. Actually provides lower fees and transactions, so the average swap is actually cheaper using slip-based fee, but as well as it produces more revenue for liquidity providers. That's very a counterintuitive statement, but that's the reason why that is because the amount of fees you pay is relative to the size of the swap you're doing. So every once in a while, a whale comes through and has a massive transaction, which we do actually see in ChaosNet today with actual funds and real money. This is validated in the real world. It's not just me, it's blowing smoke up your ass, but people come through with these massive swaps that produce large amounts of fees that get dispersed into the pool, into the owners of that pool, whoever owns liquidity in that pool. And so the net result is the ROI is actually quite better than you would see on UniSwap or SushiSwap or most of these other AMMs. Not to mention I think we're the first chain to actually do cross-chain properly, actually have support for Bitcoin and it just pretty much any coin. A lot of assets out there, or a lot of coins out there, or chains out there are just trying to do like EVM-based chains, like Gateway, for example, Compound's Gateway. Bancor, I think, supports just EVMs. Kava supports just EVMs, I believe. Not a lot of people are actually doing the work that we're doing and actually supporting any and every chain. And that's because it's actually extremely hard, which I can personally attest to. It's a very hard thing to do. And it's partially why it's never been done before, right? So it took us a long time as a team to do this. And actually, the funny thing, and not many people know this, is that THORChain actually, like the original idea, actually started pre-Uniswap. The original concept started pre-Uniswap before that was ever even established. Independently, the team had actually conceived the idea of an AMM and having a fee swapping assets and all these things, but it just took a lot longer to build and execute for a good reason. Uniswap itself is about 527 codes. Last time I looked, 527 lines of code, which is fuck all nothing. I mean, an average developer will do that in a day or two. It's really not that much code in it. But THORChain itself, the core protocol alone is 150,000 lines of code. The core protocol alone, not to mention Heimdall, which is integration tests, not to mention the UIs, the Midgard, there's threshold signatures, another 15 or 20,000 lines there, I think it is, something like that. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult to do, but the reward, the payoff is multiples over, is worth it. It's just multiples more than you get with the Uniswap or a SushiSwap or something like that.
Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a couple things from the questions and the answers. I hope everyone in the audience has as well. I'd like to invite each of the speakers on stage to offer their final thoughts, whatever they may be, even if it is I don't really have any final thoughts. That's totally valid. Thank you, Cole, for your questions. And let's go in order of the speakers as you see it in Clubhouse. Craig may be busy. Let's go to Danielle. I want to offer your final thoughts for the conversation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was I on mute?
Oh, yes, you must have been.
Yeah,
Go
you were
ahead, Craig.
muted.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. My apologies. No, what I was saying was I think it was a fantastic discussion, and it makes me want to dive a little bit deeper. It made me think of the tweet from Hal Finney in January of 2009. He said, thinking about how to reduce CO2 emissions from a widespread Bitcoin implementation. I'm thinking about how the computational needs on an ongoing basis for the Thor nodes need to sort of increase over time as the network expands. And hopefully that can be accounted, a decentralization methodology can be used to dissipate that concern going forward. But the developmental methodology that you guys have subscribed to sounds quite good. And I'm going to be diving into it much deeper. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to add, thank you so much, Michael and Chad, for hosting this conversation. And I know you guys are constantly sharing this information and really letting people ask these basic questions over and over again. So thank you so much for letting us learn here today. I think just as a Bitcoin holder myself, I've been waiting on this, and I'm really hopeful for what you guys are doing for the crypto space and also just for decentralization in general. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, and thanks to everyone who joined this chat today and connect with me on Instagram if you want to stay in touch.
Yeah, thanks for Craig and Daniel and John for your questions. I actually really enjoy them, and I actually really appreciate the driving questions to find the issue, the flaw. It's actually, I really enjoyed that part of it. So thank you so much for that. For a final thought, I personally kind of have see some correlations between Bitcoin and THORChain or Rune in that when you first learn about Bitcoin, it takes you weeks or months to really understand it. In the beginning, it might be, oh, it's like digital cash, right? You have a very simplistic view of what it is. And you could say the same thing for THORChain of like, oh, it's just like a cross-chain UniSwap, right? And you can have that simplistic view, and it's a good view. It's an accurate view. It's not like it's wrong or anything. But then you get into the kind of inner workings and the details, like, and you realize there's something much deeper going on here beyond just like, oh, a digital cash. It's actually figured out how to solve a really difficult problem. Technology is designed, how secure the threshold signatures are put together, and how that's all accomplished. And it's been a lot of time and effort for the team to put all that together. But it's something that I'm very, very much quite proud about and feel very good about. And so I really encourage people to dive as deep as you can and get involved, talk to other people, get on the Telegram channels and ask questions and all this stuff. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to unpack. It's a very complicated network versus most other networks out there, but it's really worth it, in my opinion.
John?
Sure. I just want to thank all the Michael, you for hosting this, Craig, Danielle, Chad for joining, and just this was a really fascinating topic and just really fun to listen in. I really enjoyed it. Thanks all for doing this. Anyone in the audience who's been listening for a while, if you like this kind of stuff, we'll be trying to host some more in-depth topics, some more goes to beginners. Sometimes we do casual discussions. There's a lot of different types of Into the Cryptoverse rooms that will get hosted. Just like there's many different things going on in the Cryptoverse itself. So if you liked all this, definitely follow the speakers here who all donated their time to just talk about such a cool topic for 2 hours, and follow the club and be notified when more of it happens. Thanks.
Yes, follow Into the Cryptoverse for more. Follow the speakers. And I will leave with the same claim that I began this. I truly do believe that THORChain will do more for Bitcoin than any other project being built on Bitcoin today. It's such a fascinating system that, like Bitcoin, is more than just the technology. It's the way that the incentives are aligned and the technology combined that make it worth more than the sum of each individual part. You can read more about this on thorchain.net, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.